A 15-year-old girl walked across the yard on a spring morning to have breakfast at her mother's cabin. Sheila Sharp had spent the night next door at Cabin 27, sleeping over at a friend's place, the kind of thing you do when you're 15, and the cabin next door is 20 steps away, and your mother said it was fine. She crossed the yard in the morning light, opened the front door of Cabin 28, and stepped into something that no human being should ever have to see. Her mother was dead. Her brother was dead. Her brother's friend was dead. And her 12-year-old sister, Tina, was gone, not dead in the cabin, not hiding, just gone, as if someone had taken her and walked out into the dark Sierra Nevada forest with her in the night. I am going to tell you about the scene inside that cabin, and then I am going to tell you what the scene says, because what it says is more important than what it shows, and what it says is that the person who did this knew the house. But first, Sue, because in every retelling of this case, she is the mother or the victim or the woman in Cabin 28, and she was more than that. She was 36 years old, recently divorced, raising 5 children on her own in a mountain town where the options were limited and the winters were long. She had moved to Keddie Resort, not because it was where she wanted to be, but because it was what she could afford, and she was making it work the way single mothers in hard places make things work stubbornly daily without anyone giving her credit for it. John was her eldest son, 15, old enough to be her ally in running the household. Dana Wingate, his friend who was staying the night, was 17, a kid sleeping on a floor because that is what kids do. These were not abstractions. They were people at the exact intersection of ordinary life and impossible violence, and the violence found them in the one place that was supposed to be safe. Keddie Resort was not a resort in any glamorous sense. It was a cluster of small cabins in the mountains of Plumas County in northeastern California, cheap housing mostly occupied by families with limited options. Sue Sharp was 36, a single mother, raising 5 children on what she could manage. Her oldest, Sheila, was 15. Her son, John, was 15. Her daughter, Tina, was 12. 2 younger boys, Greg and Rick, were small enough to share a room. On the night of April 11th, John had a friend staying over Dana Wingate, 17, who was sleeping on the floor of the front room. Sheila was next door. The younger boys were in the back bedroom with the door closed. Sometime in the night, someone entered Cabin 28 and killed 3 people in the front room. Sue, John, and Dana were found bound, beaten, and stabbed. The violence was prolonged. A steak knife had been bent almost in half from the force of the blows, and a hammer was found nearby. But here's the detail I need you to hold. Greg and Rick, the younger boys, were asleep in the back bedroom the entire time. They were not harmed. They were not woken. The killer moved through the cabin past their door and left them untouched. That is not the behavior of someone in a frenzy. That is the behavior of someone who knew which room held his targets and which room held children he had no interest in. And Tina was taken. Not killed in the cabin, removed from it alive or dead, and carried somewhere else. Her partial remains, a skull fragment, 3 small bones were found 3 years later in a neighboring county miles from Keddie by a bottle collector walking through the woods. The rest of her has never been recovered. Whoever killed Sue, John, and Dana did not merely attack them. He stayed long enough to manage the scene to move a 12-year-old girl out of the cabin through the resort and into the night without waking the younger boys and without being seen by anyone in the surrounding cabins. I want to sit with what that requires because the logistics themselves are evidence. You have to kill 3 people. You have to do it quietly enough, or in a part of the cabin distant enough from the back bedroom that 2 small boys do not wake. You have to either carry or lead a 12-year-old out of the cabin. You have to navigate a small resort community in the dark. And you have to do all of this with enough confidence in your knowledge of the space that you are not fumbling, not guessing, not discovering the layout as you go. You know where the knives are. You know where the hammer is. You know the doors and the windows and the distances. This is not a stranger's crime. This is a neighbor's crime. And I should be honest about the fact that I am leading you toward a conclusion, because being honest about that is part of the job. The circumstantial evidence points at people who lived at Keddie Resort, specifically at men who lived in nearby cabins, and who had documented conflicts with the Sharp family. The strongest suspicion has fallen on Marty Smart, who lived next door with his wife and had a history of domestic violence, and on a man associated with Smart, who was later linked to the scene through DNA recovered from a mattress. Both men are dead. Neither was ever charged. And the physical evidence that might have confirmed or excluded them, the murder weapons, the bindings, biological samples from the cabin, was lost, not destroyed in a fire or stolen by a suspect, lost by the Plumas County Sheriff's Department over years of storage through a combination of poor handling, institutional turnover, and what can only be described as negligence. I will not tell you that the Sheriff's Department lost the evidence deliberately. In 1981, a small mountain county department was dealing with the worst crime in its history, and the standards for evidence preservation were not what they are today. But the result is the same, regardless of the reason when investigators reopened the case decades later with modern forensic tools. Much of what they needed to test was simply no longer there. The clock did not just run out on this case. The evidence walked out of the room while nobody was watching, and here is the cruelty of it. The suspect, who DNA evidence pointed to identified in 2016, had died in 2012. 4 years too late. The man who may have killed Sue Sharp and her son and his friend, who may have taken Tina into the forest, who may have walked back to his own cabin 20 steps away and closed his door and gone to sleep. That man lived for decades after the murders in the same world as the surviving children, and died in his bed without ever being confronted with the question. And the surviving children. Sheila, Greg, Rick carried this for the rest of their lives. Sheila was the one who opened the door that morning. She was 15. That image, whatever she saw when she stepped into the front room of Cabin 28, she has carried for more than 40 years. Greg and Rick slept through it, which sounds like mercy until you realize what it actually means. They were in the cabin while their mother was being killed, separated by a wall and a closed door, and they did not know. They woke up in the morning, and their family was gone. I have covered cases where the violence is worse. I have not covered a case where the geography of the violence, the closeness, the thinness of the wall, the 20 steps between the killer's cabin and the victim's, is more suffocating than this one. The killer knew every room. He knew where the knives were and where the children slept. He stayed long enough to clean to arrange to take a girl and disappear her into the mountains. And if the strongest theory is right, he did not disappear himself at all. He walked 20 steps across a gravel yard, went inside his own cabin, and was home. It would be natural to hear that and think the proximity was physical. The killer knew the cabin because he lived next door. He stayed at the scene because the scene was already his neighborhood. Terrible, but contained a man, a cabin, a yard. The next case takes that proximity and makes it intimate in a way that is almost unbearable. Because the killer did not live next door. The killer lived inside the family at the table at the gatherings and the phone calls. He was close enough to know which child was the most loved, close enough to use that love as the weapon, and close enough that investigating him meant tearing the family apart. And tearing the family apart is exactly what happened. A phone rang in a house in the Vosges Mountains in the northeast of France. Michel Villemain picked it up. The voice on the other end was disguised, muffled, altered but familiar in a way that Michel could not quite place. It was the kind of voice you almost recognize, the kind that makes you lean in and strain and still cannot name. The voice said, "I have taken my revenge." Michel's nephew, a 4-year-old boy named Gregory, had been taken from his front yard. His hands and feet bound, a woolen cap pulled down over his eyes and thrown into the Vologne River. By the time they pulled him out, he was dead. And the voice on the phone, the person the family had come to call Le Corbeau the Crow, was someone who knew them. Someone who had been circling for years. Someone who was still at that very moment inside the family. I need to tell you about the years before Gregory died, because the murder was not the beginning. It was the end of something that had been building in the dark for a long time. The Villemains were a large working-class family in the Vosges, a region of small towns, textile mills, and wooded valleys in northeastern France. Extended family, many branches, the kind of clan where everyone knows, everyone's business, and old grievances ferment for generations. Jean-Marie Villemain. Gregory's father was a factory foreman, steady work, a decent income, a pretty wife named Christine, a healthy son. By the modest standards of the family, he had done well. And someone in the family could not forgive him for it. Beginning in the early 1980s years before Gregory's death, the Villemain household began receiving anonymous letters and phone calls. The writer called himself Le Corbeau. The letters were venomous, personal, filled with details that only someone inside the family could know. Private arguments, financial details, intimate information. The phone calls came at odd hours, the voice always disguised but always carrying the unmistakable flavor of familiarity. Le Corbeau did not threaten violence explicitly at first. He threatened humiliation, exposure, ruin. He wanted Jean-Marie to know that someone close to him hated him, and that the hatred was patient, and that it was watching. I want to pause here because this pattern, years of anonymous harassment escalating to murder, is something I have not seen in any other case in this series, and it changes the nature of the crime entirely. This was not an impulsive killing. It was not a robbery gone wrong, or a stranger's random cruelty. This was a long, deliberate campaign of psychological warfare waged by someone inside the victim's own family against a child who was chosen specifically because he was the thing Jean-Marie loved most. The murder of Gregory Villemain was not an act of violence. It was an act of revenge spoken aloud by the killer himself in real time on the telephone to a family member as the child's body was still in the water. And I need to tell you what that does to an investigation, because the mechanics of it are almost impossibly cruel. When the killer is a stranger, you cast a wide net. You look at everyone who was nearby, everyone who had opportunity, everyone whose alibi does not hold. But when the killer is inside the family, the net is the family. And every time you pull it tighter, you are pulling it around, people who are also grieving, also terrified, also broken. You cannot interrogate a cousin without the cousin's mother calling the cousin's wife, who tells the cousin's brother who stopped speaking to the uncle, who was your only witness for the timeline. The family is both the crime scene and the evidence pool and the witness list, and disturbing any part of it disturbs all of it. The Villemin investigation did not fail because the detectives were incompetent. It failed because the social structure it needed to navigate was the same structure the killer was using as camouflage. Gregory was 4 years old. Brown hair, round face, the kind of child whose photograph would be printed on every newspaper in France and would stay there for 40 years. He was playing in the front yard of his parents' house on the afternoon of October 16th. Christine was inside in the kitchen. When she came out, he was gone. Within hours, his body was pulled from the Vologne downstream, bound and drowned. His grandfather was the one who found him in the water. The investigation that followed did not solve the case. It destroyed the family. Bernard Laroche, Jean-Marie's cousin, was arrested largely on the testimony of a young girl in the family who said she had seen Laroche with Gregory. The testimony was later retracted. But before the courts could resolve the matter, Jean-Marie Villemin took a hunting rifle, drove to Laroche's house, and shot him dead in front of his wife and child. A father's grief turned into a father's vengeance, and the family's second murder was committed in broad daylight by a man who could not wait for justice to do what it was failing to do. Jean-Marie was convicted of murder and served 4 years in prison. And then, in what may be the cruelest twist in the entire case, Christine Gregory's mother, the woman whose child had been stolen from her yard, was charged with killing her own son. The theory was monstrous that she had murdered Gregory and staged the crime to frame the family she despised. The charge was eventually dismissed for lack of evidence. But Christine Villemin lived for years under the accusation that she had drowned her own 4-year-old, and the accusation came not from a stranger, but from the justice system of her own country. I will not tell you that Laroche was guilty. He was killed before a court could decide, and the testimony that put him in custody was withdrawn. I will not tell you Christine was innocent in a way that implies, I know who was guilty, I do not. What I will tell you is this. The Gregory Villemin case is the purest demonstration I have ever seen of what happens when the killer is inside the family. The investigation could not pursue the truth without destroying every relationship in the network. Every interrogation fractured a bond. Every suspicion poisoned a dinner table. Every theory turned a relative into a suspect, and a suspect into an enemy. And the family already broken by the murder of a child was broken again and again and again by the investigation that was supposed to heal it. In 2017, DNA analysis on physical evidence stamps licked on envelopes traces on the cord used to bind Gregory produced partial genetic profiles. New suspects were investigated. The case is still officially open. Le Corbeau has never been identified. He may be dead. He may be alive, elderly now, somewhere in the Vosges, carrying the knowledge of what he did to a 4-year-old boy, because a factory foreman's life looked a little too good from where he was standing. Le Corbeau stayed. That is the mechanism, and it is the cruelest one in this case. He did not stay at the scene, he stayed in the family. He attended the funeral, or he did not attend, and his absence was noted, and either way he was accounted for because he was family. He sat at tables where Gregory's name was spoken with grief. He watched the investigation tear his relatives apart, one by one, Laroche dead, Jean-Marie imprisoned, Christine accused. And he stayed through all of it, behind the disguised voice, behind the anonymous letters, behind the one word the family used for him. That was the only name he ever earned the Crow. Johnson here, the last case goes back more than a century and moves south to New Orleans. If you're still here, you are exactly who this channel is for. Subscribe and bell. Now let me set this up. In Keddie, the killer stayed at the scene 20 steps from his own front door. In the Vosges, the killer stayed in the family at the table, on the phone, in the silences. Each time the radius of staying has grown wider, more intimate, more impossible to investigate without collateral damage. The last case opens that radius to an entire city. A killer who did not merely stay in the neighborhood or the family, he stayed in the city he was terrorizing, wrote letters to its newspapers, demanded that it play music for him, and then when he was done, dissolved into its streets and was never seen again. A letter arrived at the offices of the New Orleans newspapers on a March morning, written in a voice so theatrical it read like a monologue from a stage villain. The author called himself a demon, a fell spirit from the hottest hell. He announced that he had visited the city before with his axe, and that he intended to visit again. But he offered a reprieve. On the coming Tuesday night, every house in New Orleans that was playing jazz music would be spared. Any house that was silent would receive a visit. The letter was published. The city read it. And on Tuesday night, March 19th, New Orleans played jazz every bar, every dance hall, every parlor, every porch. Bands played in the streets. A composer wrote a song called The Mysterious Axeman's Jazz. No one was attacked that night. And the man who wrote that letter, the man who made an entire city dance to avoid his axe, was somewhere in that city, listening. I want you to hold that image because it is the key to this case. A killer who is not hiding, not fleeing, not cowering in a basement. A killer who is present, who writes to the newspapers, who issues demands, who has enough confidence in his own invisibility to set a public test and watch it unfold from inside the crowd. This is a man who stayed not at the scene, not in the family, but in the city itself, as part of the city indistinguishable from its citizens walking its streets the morning after he killed in them. The attacks had been going on for months before the letter. Beginning in the spring of 1918 and continuing through the fall of 1919, someone was breaking into the homes of Italian-American families in New Orleans, mostly grocers, mostly living behind or above their shops, and attacking them with bladed weapons. The method was consistent and distinctive. The killer would remove a panel from a door to gain entry, a technique that required tools and time, and the kind of calm that does not belong to someone acting on impulse. Inside the house, he would find a weapon, an axe, a cleaver, a razor that already belonged to the victims, and he would use it. He brought nothing and left nothing except the bodies. Joseph and Catherine Maggio attacked in their bed above their grocery, Joseph's throat cut with his own razor. Louis Bissumer and Harriet Lowe attacked in their home. Lowe died months later from her injuries. Anna Schneider, 8 months pregnant, struck with an axe and left for dead, she survived. Joseph Romano found by his nieces with an axe wound to his head, he died 2 days later. The Cortimiglia family, Charles and Rosie, attacked their 2-year-old daughter, Mary, killed. I am listing the names because someone should, and because the names show you something the summary obscures. These were families, husbands and wives, a pregnant woman, a 2-year-old child. People sleeping in their own beds, in their own homes, in a city they thought was theirs. 2 things about the pattern stand out to me, and I want to explain why. First, the killer used the victim's own weapons. He walked into houses empty-handed and found what he needed inside. That means he either knew what was in each house before he entered, knew where the axe was kept, knew the layout, or he was confident enough in his ability to search a dark house with sleeping people in it that he did not need to plan. Either way, this is familiarity. Not the familiarity of a family member, but the familiarity of someone who belongs to the neighborhood, who has been inside these homes before in daylight, as a customer, a delivery man, a repairman, a neighbor. Second, the door panels. Removing a panel from a wooden door is not fast. It requires a chisel or a crowbar, steady hands, and the willingness to spend several minutes making noise in the dark outside someone's home. This is not a kick-in-the-door crime. This is patient work done by someone who is confident that the neighborhood will not notice, because the neighborhood is his, and he knows its rhythms. After the Pepitone killing in October 1919, Mike Pepitone, a grocer, struck in his bed while his wife and children slept in the next room. The attacks stopped. No announcement, no farewell letter, no arrest. The axeman simply stopped killing the way a faucet stops dripping when someone turns the handle. And the city slowly, cautiously exhaled. I want to say something about what it means for a killer to stop, because the stopping is evidence too, and no one talks about it enough. When a serial killer is caught, the stopping is explained. He is in custody. He is dead. The system removed him. When a serial killer chooses to stop the stopping, tells you something about the person he has enough self-control to walk away. He is not driven by compulsion so overwhelming that it cannot be overridden. He is making decisions about when to kill, when to write, when to demand jazz, and when to quit. That level of control is chilling because it means the violence was never involuntary. Every attack was chosen, and the choice to stop was just as deliberate as the choice to start. There is a suspect, a name that has circulated for a century. Joseph Maumphrey, a man with a criminal record, was allegedly shot and killed in Los Angeles by the widow of Mike Pepitone, who reportedly recognized him as her husband's killer. The story has been repeated so often that it has the weight of fact. But I should be honest about what the careful sources say. The Maumphrey story is difficult to verify. Some researchers have been unable to find records confirming a Joseph Maumphrey was killed in Los Angeles in the right time frame. Others have found fragments that support it. I give it to you as the legend it has become, not as the answer the case deserves. The axeman of New Orleans was never conclusively identified, and I want to close this case with something that I think matters more than the suspect's name, because it is the thing that connects the axeman to every other killer in this episode. The axeman was not a ghost. He was not a demon from the hottest hell, whatever his letter said. He was a man who lived in New Orleans, who bought groceries and paid rent and walked streets and knew which Italian families kept axes in their kitchens. He was a neighbor, not in the sense of living next door like the Ketty suspect, but in the broader sense. He was part of the fabric of the city. He ate its food and breathed its air and listened to its music, the same music he demanded on the night he spared it. And when he was done killing, he did not leave that fabric. He folded back into it. He became once again just another man on the sidewalk, indistinguishable from the thousands of other men who had never swung an axe at a sleeping family. The city could not find him because the city was full of him, full of men who looked exactly like what he looked like when he was not killing. A cabin in the California mountains where the killer knew which room held the children and which held the targets. A family in the French Vosges where the killer's voice on the telephone was almost recognizable but never quite named. A city in Louisiana where a man with an axe demanded that the whole town play music, and the town obeyed, and the man dissolved into the crowd. 3 killers who never left. And 3 investigations that could not find them precisely because they were looking for someone who had gone a fugitive, a stranger, a shadow running into the distance. The systems we build to catch killers are built on the assumption of flight. Fingerprints at the scene, tire tracks on the road, a suspect who wasn't where he said he was. But when the killer is still there, still in the cabin next door, still at the family dinner, still walking the same streets as the detectives, the system doesn't know how to read his presence. It reads absence. It reads departure. And the man who never departed is the one it cannot see. The hardest person to find is not the one who runs the farthest. It is the one who does not run at all, who stays so close that looking for him means looking through him, past him, around him, at everything except the person standing right there. Sheila Sharp opened her door and walked into the worst morning of her life. The Villamin family picked up a ringing phone and heard a voice they almost knew. New Orleans played jazz because a man they had never seen told them to. In each case, the killer was close enough to hear the grief he caused. And in each case, that closeness was the one clue nobody read. I'm Johnson. Thank you for sitting with the hard ones. I'll see you on the next.